This is a story about a war fought not just with steel and gunpowder, but with pharmacology and desperate human chemistry. It is the untold truth of the drug that powered the early blitzkrieg and ultimately broke the minds and bodies of the German army. It is the story of how a small white pill became a secret weapon of the Wehrmacht, granting soldiers a brief, terrifying glimpse of perpetual motion. The Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, was the very foundation of German military doctrine in the early stages of World War II. It was a terrifyingly successful concept built on speed, surprise, and relentless non-stop movement. The panzer divisions would bypass fixed defenses, sever supply lines, and push deep into enemy territory without pausing. This strategy demanded not just revolutionary machines, but superhuman men. Men who could drive for 48 hours straight, men who could fight for 3 days without sleep, men who could ignore the screaming exhaustion of their own bodies. It demanded something entirely unnatural. The problem quickly became evident during the invasion of Poland in 1939. The trucks stalled, not from mechanical failure, but because the drivers fell asleep at the wheel. The infantry lagged far behind the fast-moving tanks, exhausted after forced marches across vast plains. The human body, it turned out, was the weakest link in the chain of the Blitzkrieg. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of the panzer divisions, recognized this critical vulnerability. He needed a solution that would turn his soldiers into tireless, emotionless machines capable of maintaining the breakneck tempo of the Lightning War. He needed a drug. The answer came in the form of Pervitin, a product manufactured by the Berlin-based Temmler Pharmaceutical Company. Pervitin was not a new or obscure substance. It was essentially methamphetamine, widely available, over-the-counter in Germany at the time, marketed as a treatment for depression and a general stimulant. It was, in the words of one enthusiastic German doctor, a pill that removes fear and promotes aggression. The military medical branch saw its potential immediately. Unlike the limited effects of coffee or nicotine, Pervitin promised a complete suppression of fatigue. It could turn a weary, frightened soldier into an alert, euphoric, and aggressive fighting unit. Mass testing began almost immediately. The results were astonishing. Soldiers who had been awake for 24 hours could suddenly perform complex duties, march further, and maintain sharp vigilance, all while feeling an artificial sense of well-being and invincibility. The side effects, such as nervousness, heart palpitations, and addiction, were conveniently ignored in the single-minded pursuit of military superiority. The pills were officially incorporated into the German military supply chain. They were not classified as narcotics, but rather as stimulants. The drug was distributed in small, easy-to-carry blister packs. The instructions were terrifyingly simple: 1 pill to combat fatigue, 2 pills for sustained action, and in the case of emergency or sustained combat, 3 pills could be taken. The logistics were seamless. A simple piece of government-issued cardboard containing the pills was as vital a piece of equipment as a gas mask or a helmet. The invasion of France in 1940 became the drug's proving ground. It was here that Pervitin was deployed on a massive industrial scale. The legendary breakthrough through the Ardennes forest. The supposed impassable natural barrier that the French High Command had deemed safe was powered largely by the pills. German tank crews, particularly those operating the fast-moving panzers, were kept awake for 72 hours straight, maintaining the rapid advance that shocked and paralyzed the Allied forces. The French and British armies, bound by normal human limits of rest and sleep, were simply unable to cope with an enemy that never seemed to stop. The drug allowed the Wehrmacht to violate the fundamental laws of warfare. They could attack when the enemy was sleeping. They could bypass resistance and keep driving. The pills created a temporal advantage. They literally stole hours from the enemy's operational time. The speed of the advance was so unexpected, so biologically unnatural, that it shattered the Allied command structure's ability to react. The drug, in effect, accelerated the entire pace of the war. The French campaign was a stunning, almost unbelievable success, and Pervitin received a large share of the credit, though kept largely out of public. The German High Command became convinced that this pharmacological edge was a necessary component of the Blitzkrieg. The need for an ever-present, readily available supply of the pill became absolute. The promise of perpetual motion was too seductive to ignore. However, the consequences of this widespread, systematic military drug abuse began to surface almost immediately. Even amidst the euphoria of victory, the dependence began to creep in. The soldiers who had relied on the pills to stay awake now found they couldn't function without them. The crash after the high was brutal, marked by severe depression, paranoia, and incapacitating exhaustion. The drug that gave them invincibility also made them irritable, aggressive, far beyond rational command, and psychologically fragile. This reliance on an artificial high was a time bomb placed at the very core of the Wehrmacht. The pills could suppress the feeling of fatigue, but they could not replace the actual restorative power of sleep. The drug only burned the candle at both ends, consuming the soldiers' physical and mental reserves at a dangerous speed. The short-term tactical gain was bought at the ultimate long-term strategic cost, the psychological and physical deterioration of the troops. The stage was set for the Eastern Front, a vast grinding meat grinder where the reliance on Pervitin would transition from a tactical advantage to a crushing liability. The stunning victory in France was a pharmacological triumph as much as a military one. The High Command, blinded by the speed of their success, failed to truly analyze the hidden costs of Pervitin, the drug that had fueled the unstoppable advance. They learned the wrong lesson, that they could simply medicate their way past the inherent limits of human endurance. This arrogance, fueled by chemical euphoria, set the stage for the Eastern Front, where the drug would transform from a strategic asset into a crippling liability. Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union, was the ultimate test of the Wehrmacht's reliance on Pervitin. The scale of the Eastern Front dwarfed the French campaign. The distances were vast, the infrastructure non-existent, and the supply lines stretched to the breaking point. In these conditions, the demand for the drug skyrocketed. The soldiers were facing an enemy that, unlike the French, refused to break, and a landscape that seemed to swallow entire armies. The pace of the blitzkrieg, which had worked so flawlessly in Western Europe, began to falter, and as it faltered, the pills became less about maintaining speed and more about forcing the last. The initial push was still remarkably fast, often driven by the soldiers' willingness, or chemical compulsion, to ignore the overwhelming signs of exhaustion. Letters sent home by German soldiers reveal a chilling dependency. One soldier wrote, "It is cold and we march constantly. The men are weak, but after taking the pills, I feel no fatigue, only a desperate need to keep moving." The drug not only kept them awake, but instilled a state of high aggression, overriding the natural fear response. This was the reason for the terrifying intensity of the early fighting. The German soldier was, for periods, fighting outside the normal boundaries of human fear and fatigue. However, the sheer duration of the Eastern Campaign exposed the drug's fatal limitations. The human brain cannot simply run on fumes indefinitely. Pervitin is an appetite suppressant, meaning soldiers were not only going without sleep, but often without adequate nourishment. They were burning through their physical and mental reserves at an unsustainable rate. The euphoric high was inevitably followed by a devastating crash. Acute psychosis, hallucinations, severe depression, and paranoia. Doctors and field medics on the Eastern Front began to file increasingly alarming reports. They were treating soldiers who had been awake for 5 or 6 days straight, men who were essentially sleepwalking zombies, unable to recognize their comrades or follow basic orders. The drug had given them temporary strength, but it had stripped them of their ability to reason, to exercise sound judgment, and to function as cohesive military units. The disciplined, meticulous German soldier was being replaced by an irritable, hyper-aggressive shadow of his former self. The famous Panzer General Heinz Guderian, who had championed the drug's use in the French campaign, began to note its destructive effects on his troops during the long march toward Moscow. The sheer number of vehicles abandoned, not due to enemy fire, but due to human error and mechanical neglect caused by sleep deprivation, began to climb. The pill could keep a driver awake, but it couldn't stop him from making catastrophic mistakes after days of continuous strain. The descent into the infamous Russian winter, as discussed in the previous part, magnified the drug's liability. Soldiers who had taken the pill to stave off cold and exhaustion found themselves suffering worse from frostbite. The amphetamine heightened their awareness and suppressed the feeling of cold, leading them to ignore early warning signs of frostbite until the damage was irreversible. What should have been a warning twinge of pain was masked by a chemical high, resulting in thousands of amputations and the permanent loss of combat effectiveness for entire divisions. The dependency deepened. As the strategic situation turned against the Wehrmacht, the pills stopped being a tool for victory and became a necessary crutch against defeat. Soldiers weren't taking Pervitin to march faster. They were taking it to endure the relentless shelling, the freezing conditions, and the omnipresent threat of death. It was self-medication against the crushing reality of the war of attrition. By 1942 and 1943, the High Command was desperately trying to control the massive flow of the drug, now recognizing the rampant addiction and the long-term psychological damage, but it was far too late. The dependency was endemic. The problem was compounded by the drug's use by high-ranking officers and even Hitler himself. who was being administered an array of cocktail drugs by his personal physician, the infamous Theodore Morel. The High Command was often making strategic decisions while chemically compromised, adding another layer of irrationality to an already flawed military structure. The war was being run by men running on chemically induced adrenaline and euphoria. This truth about the Wehrmacht's chemical dependency is a dark, complex corner of history. If you find this deep dive into the hidden factors that shaped World War II compelling, please take a second right now and hit that subscribe button. Supporting the channel allows us to keep uncovering the secrets and unseen stories of the past. If you're already a subscriber, thank you for your unwavering support. Now, let's explore the final, desperate phase of this chemical war. By the time of the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, the drug's use was both pervasive and ineffective. The Soviet forces had learned to adapt to the blitzkrieg speed, and the sheer logistical size of the conflict negated the minor tactical advantages the pills could offer. The German soldier was psychologically exhausted, and the drug could no longer conjure the illusion of strength. It was merely prolonging the agony. The ultimate tragedy of Pervitin lies in the complete disregard for the individual soldier. The Wehrmacht viewed the drug as a simple military resource, interchangeable with ammunition or fuel, rather than recognizing its devastating impact on human health. The soldiers were casualties of a war, fought not only on the battlefield, but within their own neural chemistry. The drug delivered on its promise to keep them awake, but the price was their mental stability, their long-term health, and ultimately, the integrity of the fighting force itself. The secret weapon had turned on its users, transforming the Wehrmacht from a force of superhuman efficiency into an army of broken, addicted men struggling through a never-ending nightmare. The tactical advantage gained in 1940 was paid for in the psychiatric wards and cemeteries of 1945. The secret weapon had done its job. It had powered the Wehrmacht past the biological limits of the blitzkrieg, conquering vast stretches of Europe in record time. But by the time the war entered its middle and final phase, the price of this chemical advantage was due. The drug that gave the German soldiers invincibility on the march had stripped them of their resilience in the long, grueling war of attrition. The descent into addiction and psychological breakdown became the grim, invisible cost of the early victories. The long-term effects of widespread Pervitin abuse were devastating and long-lasting, extending far beyond the battlefield. The drug's legacy was one of profound psychological trauma. Soldiers returned home, if they returned at all, suffering not only from the mental scars of combat, but from debilitating dependence. The government's efforts to control the flow of the drug failed spectacularly, leading to a generation of veterans struggling with addiction, a problem that the Nazi regime, obsessed with the image of the pure Aryan soldier, desperately tried to cover up. Medical records from the period immediately following the war reveal an alarming number of former soldiers presenting with severe psychiatric issues, depression and paranoia, all hallmarks of chronic amphetamine abuse. The drug, in essence, created a perverse feedback loop of desperation. The initial euphoria was so potent that when the soldiers hit the inevitable crash, they required more of the drug, not for tactical advantage, but simply to feel normal and combat the crushing despair. In the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, Pervitin was not a tool for winning. It was a desperate form of survival, a temporary escape from the cold, the fear, and the sheer hopelessness of the situation. The soldiers were casualties of a war fought in their veins long before they were hit by a Soviet bullet. The lessons learned from the Wehrmacht's chemical dependency are critical, not just for military history, but for understanding the ethics of warfare and the limits of human performance. Firstly, the illusion of endurance. Pervitin proved that chemical enhancement can grant a temporary tactical edge, but it cannot override the fundamental need for rest and recovery. The drug did not create energy. It merely forced the body to burn its own reserves at a hyper-accelerated rate. The tactical gains of 1940 were negated by the strategic collapse of morale and health in 1943 and 1940. Military strategists learned that the human element is not a machine to be simply refueled with chemicals, but a complex system that requires holistic care. Secondly, the strategic corruption of judgment. The widespread use of Pervitin extended beyond the frontline troops to the high command, influencing critical decisions. As documented in the records of the time, Hitler himself received daily injections of a complex cocktail of drugs, including some amphetamine-like substances from his personal physician, Theodore Morel. The war, particularly in its later stages, was being directed by leaders whose judgment was often impaired by euphoria, paranoia, and the very volatility that is characteristic of amphetamine use. This chemical impairment at the top contributed to the rigid, irrational decisions, such as the hold-at-all-costs orders, that cost the lives of countless German soldiers. The drug did not just alter the soldiers' perception of the world. It may have fundamentally altered the course of the war by clouding the strategic vision of its leaders. Thirdly, the normalization of extreme measures. The Wehrmacht's open, systematic use of methamphetamine normalized the concept of using powerful, addictive drugs to achieve military goals. This precedent had a quiet, insidious influence on later conflicts and modern military practices, leading to ongoing debates about the ethical limits of performance-enhancing drugs. In combat scenarios, the story of Pervitin is a stark warning about the short-sighted, utilitarian view of the soldier as a disposable resource. The Wehrmacht's secret weapon was not a single technology, but a pill that suppressed the very human traits, fear, fatigue, and self-preservation, that ensure long-term functionality. The drug promised them the strength of 10 men, but in the end, it robbed them of the strength of one. The price was paid not in the gold reserves of the Reich, but in the psychological wreckage of a generation of young men. The Blitzkrieg was built on speed, but its foundation was chemical sand, and when the grinding war of attrition arrived, the foundation crumbled, leaving behind a legacy of addiction and despair. We've seen how a small, white pill powered the Wehrmacht's early victories, but the story doesn't end here. The dark, pharmacological history of the Second World War is deep and often unsettling, so we want to know what you think. Do you believe that Pervitin was an essential tactical advantage in the initial Blitzkrieg, or was it a moral and strategic error from day one? Share your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. We read every single argument on the true cost of this secret weapon, and if you want to understand another hidden, terrifying factor that shaped the war, the one weapon that both the Nazis and the Allies feared more than the atom bomb, click on the video link right here on your screen now.